The first time I noticed something unusual about Mrs. Lenora was on one of those still, quiet afternoons in early fall. The sun had just begun its descent, casting long, golden shadows over the neighborhood. I was sitting on my porch, lost in my own thoughts. Lenora, my neighbor of 60 years, had always lived next door, her presence as constant as the seasons. She wasn't the sort of woman people noticed in a loud or obvious way, but there was a quiet grace about her, a kind of elegance that age had only refined. That afternoon, I found myself watching her as she tended to the flowers in her garden. At first, she didn't see me, too absorbed in the rhythm of her task. Her hands moved gently over the blossoms, and for a moment, the scene seemed timeless, as if nothing in the world could disturb its serenity. I had seen her do this countless times, yet this time, something felt different. The way the soft evening light shimmered in her silver-streaked hair, the way she moved with such effortless poise, it all made me pause and really see her, as if for the first time. When she finally glanced up, our eyes met. She smiled, a warm, knowing smile that stirred something unexpected in me. I smiled back, though the strange feeling lingered, even after she returned to her flowers. There was something about her I hadn't noticed before, something that stayed with me long after the evening had faded. A few days later, we crossed paths again. I was struggling to fix a broken fence when Lenora appeared at the edge of her yard, hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan. "Need some help with that?" she called, her voice calm and amused. I looked up, wiping the sweat from my brow, and chuckled. "I think I might be in over my head." She smiled and walked over with deliberate, unhurried steps. "Lucky for you, I'm pretty handy with a hammer." As she knelt beside me to help, the air seemed to lighten. I couldn't help but steal glances at her. Up close, she was even more striking, the fine lines around her eyes only adding to her beauty. There was a quiet confidence in the way she moved, as if she was entirely comfortable with herself and the world around her. "Not many people fix things themselves anymore," she remarked after a while, her tone casual. "Everyone's too busy, too impatient." I nodded, feeling unexpectedly at ease in her company. "I guess I like to keep my hands busy." She looked at me, then really looked at me, and for a brief moment something shifted between us. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, like an unspoken understanding. "I know what you mean," she said softly, her gaze lingering on mine just a heartbeat too long before she turned back to the fence. As we finished up, Lenora stood, brushing the dust from her hands. "That should hold for now," she said with a satisfied smile. "Thanks for the help," I replied, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "I owe you one." She smiled again, a soft, enigmatic smile that seemed to carry more weight than the words she spoke. "I'm sure you'll find a way to repay me," she said lightly, before turning back toward her garden. I watched her walk away, my heart inexplicably racing. Something had shifted between us in those brief moments, something I couldn't quite put into words. I didn't fully understand what was happening between us, but I knew it was something I wouldn't be able to forget. In the days that followed, Lenora lingered in my thoughts far more than I cared to admit. Each time I saw her, whether she was in her garden or simply passing by, there was an undeniable tension in the air. It was subtle, like a quiet hum beneath the surface, but impossible to ignore. I'd catch her glancing at me from across the street, her eyes lingering just a moment too long, and every time, that same flutter stirred deep within me. It made no sense. She was my neighbor, someone I'd known for years. I had always respected her, but had never seen her in this light before. Now, there was something magnetic about her, a pull I couldn't explain. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was still striking at 60. It was something deeper, a quiet confidence in the way she moved, the way she carried herself. She was a woman who knew exactly who she was, who had weathered life's storms and emerged stronger for it, and I found myself irresistibly drawn to that. One afternoon, as I sat idly flipping through a book, a knock at the door broke my trance. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, there she stood, Lenora, with a small basket in her hands. "Hi," she said, her warm smile catching me off guard as always. "I baked too many cookies and thought you might like some." I smiled back, though my heart had already begun to race. Thanks. Come in. She stepped inside, her presence filling the room with an easy familiarity, as if she had been there countless times before. We made small talk, the weather, the neighborhood, but even as we spoke, there was an undercurrent between us, something unspoken yet undeniable. After a while, Lenora looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. You seem a little distracted, she said softly, her voice gentle and filled with concern. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. The truth was, I was distracted by her, but I couldn't bring myself to admit it. Just a lot on my mind, I replied, the words feeling hollow. She stepped closer, her eyes still searching mine. Anything you want to talk about? She asked, her tone soothing. I swallowed hard, the tension between us thickening with every passing second. There was something in her gaze, a knowing look that made me feel like she understood far more than I was letting on. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to tell her everything about the confusion, the desire that had been building since that day in the garden. But instead, I shook my head and forced a smile. No, I'm fine. Just little things piling up. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she reached out and gently placed her hand on my arm. What was meant to be a comforting gesture sparked something electric between us. My breath hitched, and for a brief moment, we stood frozen, the air charged with a tension neither of us could deny. Slowly, she withdrew her hand, but the space between us crackled with unspoken emotions. I should probably go, she said softly, her voice quieter now, as if she, too, had felt the shift. I nodded, my throat tight. Yeah. Thanks again for the cookies. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something there, something deeper, more conflicted. As she left, I stood there, my heart pounding, wondering what had just transpired. That night, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind, her touch, the look in her eyes, the way the air between us had thickened. It wasn't just in my head. There had been something real, something undeniable. But what did it mean? And what was I supposed to do about it? For days, I tried to push thoughts of Lenora away, but it was impossible. Every time I saw her, the tension returned, and I found myself watching her more closely, wondering if she felt the same way. Every glance, every smile, every lingering look seemed to carry a new, deeper meaning. One late evening, as I sat on my porch, I saw her standing in her yard, arms folded as she looked up at the sky. The soft glow of the street lamp cast a gentle light on her face, making her look almost ethereal. I don't know what compelled me, but before I knew it, I was walking toward her, calling her name. She turned, surprised, but smiled. Can't sleep either? I shook my head. Just needed some air. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the cool night air wrapping around us. There was something about the stillness, the closeness of the moment, that made everything else fall away. I could feel the tension simmering between us, growing stronger, until finally, I spoke. Lenora, do you ever feel like there's something between us? Something unspoken. She didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her voice was barely a whisper. Yes, she said softly. I feel it too. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and my heart raced. We had crossed a line, even if only with words, and there was no turning back. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. What does that mean, Lenora? Her eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of longing and hesitation. I don't know, she whispered, but I know I can't ignore it anymore. In that moment, everything felt raw and exposed. We were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything. And yet, the pull between us was undeniable.